So welcome to this session today on the impact of war on the development of Yemen from data to practice. This is part of the 2020 Fragility Forum by the World Bank. My name is Marina and I am the director covering Yemen, Egypt and Djibouti. Today we are hosting the first part of a series of two looking at the impact of the protracted conflict in Yemen on development outcomes, multiple dimensions of development outcomes. This will be followed by a panel discussion with Yemeni and international partners around project interventions and approaches that can help communities in Yemen and elsewhere cope with crises and rebuild in a sustainable manner. So going back to today, we will have a presentation by Jonathan Moyer, who has been leading some UNDP commissioned work, followed by a fireside chat between Jonathan and myself. Jonathan is an assistant professor at the Joseph Goebbels School of International Studies, and he has assisted strategic planning efforts of many governments and international organizations around the world. He also leads the creation of new data and tools to better understand and analyze international relations. I think he is perfectly placed for the session today. So Jonathan, let me hand the floor to you for an initial presentation.
Thank you, Marina. I really appreciate this opportunity to present some work that we have been leading in collaboration with the UNDP. And I'll share my screen, and hopefully you all can see this at the moment. And I'll pause a bit in case there needs to be any editing around this. Okay, so I'm here to present the work of two studies that were commissioned by the UNDP and that were carried out largely by the Pardee Center for International Futures. My name is Jonathan Moyer, and I'm the director of the Pardee Center, and these reports were produced in collaboration with a number of my colleagues who are on the screen. The focus of this presentation, this brief presentation, will be the results of the two reports. And what we were exploring was the impact of conflict on human development in Yemen across multiple dimensions. So this slide introduces some of the key findings, and then I'll move into the methodology and unpack some findings in a more specific way. So the war in Yemen has set back human development by 21 years through the end of 2019. As the conflict continues through 2020, that setback in human development accelerates. So the longer the conflict goes, the further back human development indicators are pushed back into the past. The conflict also is responsible for killing one child every 12 minutes. That was as of 2019. The number in 2020 is closer to every 11 and a half minutes. A child under 5 is killed by the conflict. That's both directly and indirectly, and I'll unpack that a little bit more as we move through this presentation. The war in Yemen has greatly increased extreme poverty. It has dramatically reduced caloric availability, destroyed the ability to produce economically in general, though it has allowed the ability to produce economically to persist in some areas and increased income inequality quite significantly as well. It has worsened an already dire gender inequality situation, and it has, in general, reduced any progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. International assistance is essential, but it can only do so much. The findings at the end of the second report concluded that in order to improve human development, the only path forward was ending the conflict. The methodology that we used in this report was building off of a tool called International Futures. And this slide demonstrates the two scenarios that we created. We created one scenario that reflected development in Yemen across multiple dimensions, starting in 2014, where there was no conflict. So this is a scenario where that represents how Yemen would have developed in the absence of conflict. And then a second scenario that reflected how Yemen developed during the conflict and a projection of that continuation of conflict. So that allowed us to compare a conflict scenario with a no conflict scenario, which allows us to talk about conflict attributable development impacts. We did this within a tool called International Futures. And this is a freely available quantitative model. It's open source. It's an academic resource, and that represents development for 186 countries across these multiple dimensions that are interconnected within the system. So we can talk about the relationship between economic, demographic, human development, et cetera, et cetera. So for some of the core findings, I mentioned that conflict has set back human development by 21 years. What we mean by that is that the Human Development Index value for Yemen has been set back by 21 years as of the end of 2019. So the green line represents what the historical data and our projection estimated for the Human Development Index in Yemen without conflict. The red line represents the onset of conflict and the level of HDI that we estimate Yemen to have at the end of 2019. However, as the conflict continues, we estimate that the effect on reducing developmental gains is accelerated. So if the conflict continues through the end of 2022, we estimate that the development setback will be at 26 years, and if it continues through 2030, it could extend to 4 decades. This graph shows the effect both on direct and indirect mortality. So the green line shows that through the end of 2019, we estimate 102,000 direct deaths. That's very close to what groups like ACLID would estimate. And that the indirect mortality, though, is larger. And the indirect mortality reflects people who have lost their lives because of access to food, health services, and other kinds of social support policies that would exist in a world without conflict in Yemen. So the indirect mortality is about 130,000, more than the direct mortality through the end of 2019, and that's only grown through 2020. I'll show 2 more sets of results, and then my time will be up. First is looking at the effect of conflict on extreme poverty. When conflict started in 2014, about 18.8% of the population lived on less than $1.90 a day. As in a no-conflict scenario, we expected this to reduce, though not to reduce in ways that were incredibly dramatic until we got closer to 2030, though Yemen still didn't achieve the SDGs. In a conflict scenario, however, the effect of the conflict has been to increase extreme poverty in the short term by about 40 percentage points of the population. So a dramatic increase. And as the conflict continues, we expect that increase in extreme poverty to continue to grow. The final section of results that I'll show is looking at the effect of humanitarian and development policy interventions on improving SDG achievement in Yemen in the midst of conflict and then without conflict. We created 4 scenarios that looked at increasing household consumption, improving food distribution, increasing access to water and sanitation, and targeting child malnutrition. This graph shows the progress that we expected Yemen to make towards achieving the SDGs in a world without conflict. So in that world, about 40% of the gap that existed in 2015 is closed on the approach to 2030. In a conflict scenario, however, the gap widens. And so instead of making progress towards achieving the SDGs, though not achieving the SDGs fully in a no conflict scenario, we expected SDG achievement to be retarded significantly. Those alternative lines there show different scenario interventions and their effect on SDG achievement in the midst of conflict. They can improve the country's ability to achieve SDGs, but they certainly do not change the trajectory of the development pathway. The only line that changes the trajectory of the development pathway that Yemen is on is the elimination of conflict. It may seem like a simple or straightforward takeaway, but we're demonstrating through quantitative techniques that there isn't enough. You can't just simply throw an obscene amount of money at this problem in the midst of conflict and turn the development trajectory of Yemen around. Really, the core policy need at the end of the day is ending the conflict, which can unlock a significant amount of development moving forward. So in conclusion, the conflicts damaged the social fabric of Yemen, turned a humanitarian crisis into a developmental crisis with adverse effects on future generations. As the conflict persists, the possibility of a balkanized Yemen is increasingly likely, and international assistance is essential but can only do so much to mitigate the impacts of conflict on development. Ending the war is truly the only option.
Jonathan, thank you so very much for that crisp, to the point, but also quite dire presentation. I was really struck impact of the conflict on the poverty numbers in some of your slides. But maybe the strongest message is that of the need to really end the conflict, also from an economic and social perspective. I think you make a very strong case that the economy and the social impact of Yemen will not be fully unlocked and unleashed. Yemen will not reach its full potential until we see a peace deal. At the World Bank, we have been doing quite a lot of thinking about how we can stay engaged in active conflict. And we have a new strategy for fragile and conflict countries, and Yemen has really been critical in informing that strategy. In Yemen, our program, World Bank, and working with our partners, including the UN institutions, we've really tried to be at the frontier of the humanitarian developmental nexus so that we can help Yemen recover, including by strengthening local institutions when the time is right. So to really go beyond the direct humanitarian interventions, but to also take a broader developmental role. Now, I'm very keen to hear from you, based on the research that you have done, what more you think can be done to help Yemen come out of this very, very difficult situation. What kind of interventions do you think, based on your research, could be most helpful and could have the best results in the context of Yemen? You shared already some thoughts, including on safety nets, on cash transfers, on health, on WASH interventions. I think it is very important that we work closely together on this with our bilateral partners, the bank, the UN institution, critically also with the local Yemeni institutions, and we will talk more about that later on in this session, in part 2 of this session. But very interested to hear your thoughts. Based on the analysis you have done, how can we go from here?
Thank you for that question, and it's a very complicated one. And I think you unpacked some of the complicated aspects as the bank is working in between a humanitarian crisis, a development crisis, and in an ongoing conflict that has a variety of distinct characteristics in different parts of the country. It's a real challenge to think about how to move forward. When we modeled alternative policy approaches that could be used in the midst of conflict, we approached it from a systems perspective. So all of our quantitative work thinks about the world and development as an integrated set of systems. And so when we're thinking about policy interventions, we're mostly interested in how the magnitude of intervention would affect direct outcomes, but then how those direct outcomes will have indirect effects elsewhere. We modeled, as you mentioned, cash transfers We modeled looking at child welfare and child malnutrition systems. We modeled improving access to safe water and sanitation. And we also modeled an improvement in food access and food distribution. Each of those interventions had positive outcomes on immediate development indicators. But each of those interventions was insufficient to really bend the curve on the broader development outcomes in Yemen. Some interventions I think that are quite important to consider from the perspective of Yemeni development are related to food security. Food security is a tremendously important issue area for a country that prior to conflict was, I've seen figures between 60 and 90% dependent on food imports for consumption. So that's an incredibly vulnerable development system vis-a-vis Yemeni development in the face of ongoing conflict. So if you can improve access to food, that can be a real game changer for certain parts of the country. The problem with that is multiple fold. One very core health-related problem is that food access, if it's intermittent, doesn't always improve development outcomes in places with poor access to water and sanitation. So improving the water and sanitation space can improve nutritional retainment and can reduce communicable disease mortality. So some of these indirect conflict mortalities I was describing earlier, and that can be a good thing. But improving water and sanitation in the absence of food access is a challenge. And you can have food access and improved water and sanitation, which can reduce child mortality related to malnutrition or undernutrition, but it certainly doesn't eliminate it in all cases. My point would simply be that any approach to humanitarian and developmental assistance needs to take a holistic perspective and a systems perspective that understands and considers trade-offs in implementing one policy in one local context. And I completely agree that the getting input from the local context is absolutely crucial for these policies to be successful. But understanding those effects within a broader framework that thinks about development as a dynamic process. I think that's kind of the core finding of a study like this about the effect of doing developmental and humanitarian assistance in the midst of an ongoing conflict.
No, John, I think these are really it's not easy to think developmental needs, but it is really critical to also look through interventions with this developmental lens on. And I think your research shows that point very nicely. You also made the point that there are a lot of vulnerabilities already in Yemen at this point, and I think you will not be surprised by my next question, because of course now Yemen, like many other countries in the world, has also been heavily hit by the impact of the COVID pandemic. Now, I know you did not have a chance to incorporate this into the analysis since it's all evolving. But Yemen does have one of the highest fatality rates in the world. So I'd be interested to hear your views on how the development indicators and how the scenarios that you outlined could be influenced by the impact of COVID-19, recognizing fully that it's still a very fluid situation and it's a different question to ask in the world right now, and especially in Yemen.
I think it's a very challenging question. My response to thinking about the effect of COVID on development in Yemen in the midst of the conflict is to try to apply this systems perspective again, which would require thinking about the effect of COVID independent of the effect of conflict on development. The effect of COVID on development, and we've done quite a bit of work with the UN and the African Union thinking about the effect of COVID on development more broadly. That effect tends to be directly on increasing mortality and morbidity, reducing people's ability to do work, reducing people's ability to participate in the economy, and then governmental responses to mitigate the spread and to catalyze more economic activity. The effect of COVID on conflict could be to reduce some of the severity of conflict for the same reasons that COVID could reduce people's ability to participate in the workforce. If soldiers are sick, they can't participate, et cetera, et cetera. The other effect, though, is absolutely devastating for people who are in developmentally very vulnerable contexts, or people who are already suffering from food insecurity, people who are in the midst of a humanitarian and developmental crisis. Like they truly are, the COVID is adding injury to injury to injury that already exists. So in that context, it's absolutely devastating. So I think there's still some understanding that we need to have in terms of the research community about the effect of COVID on conflict, which I think is a bit of, some people have read things, or some people think that COVID will reduce conflict in the short term. Other people have other views, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. But certainly the effect of COVID on development is to exacerbate ongoing developmental injustices. And there's a real need to respond to that as an international community in ways that can mitigate these real developmental needs in the midst of an ongoing conflict and crisis.
Great,
Would it be helpful for
Jonathan.
me to repeat that at all, or were you there for enough of it, Marina?
I could hear all of that.
Okay.
I can repeat one of the questions later, of course, if need be. Look, from my side, and also keeping in mind the length considerations, I'm happy to kind of give a few final closing words, but I want to check whether there's something you want to emphasize, Jonathan, before we do that.
I feel like I've been sufficiently loquacious that I'm happy for you. I'm happy for you to provide any closing comments you'd like.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you so very much. I think this was a very good stage setting opening for the panel discussion that we are going to have next on interventions to help Yemen rebuild and to help Yemenis cope with the very dire situation and the very dire challenges that they face. So Jonathan, thank you so much. Some of your findings are definitely very motivating and make us want to do more to help the people in Yemen to cope with this very difficult situation and to support them in building a better future. Thank you very much.